Fortunately, today we're going to go on a field tour, virtually, of course, which won't be near as much fun as doing it in person, but we do the things that we have to do. So we're going to take the opportunity to look at cover crop work that's been done from central Oregon across southern Idaho and down into Utah. So as we prepare for that, we have several good presentations ready for you. And of course, on this tour, you're going to be responsible for your own snacks and potty breaks. So pace yourself as we go through our tour today. Just a couple of housekeeping things before we get started here real quick. Again, I would like to just take a second and recognize the people who've helped make this conference webinar series possible. Also on my team, again, I'm Steve Hines. I'm with University of Idaho Extension in Jerome County. Claire Sullivan is an extension educator with Oregon State University. Jason Thomas is an extension educator with the University of Idaho. Lauren Golden is a program coordinator on our project. Soren Newman is with the University of Idaho, and she's a senior researcher who's helping us with the evaluation part of this program. And then, of course, we really want to thank Western SARE for providing the grant funds to make this opportunity possible. You'll notice that we're in a webinar setup, so all cameras and mics have been turned off and muted. So if you have questions as we go through, just go ahead and type those in the chat box or in the question and answer box, and we'll try to get to a few of those as we can. What we will do today is try to keep our tour moving along, and then as we get to the end, then we'll try to answer as many questions as we can. So ride along with us. If you have to leave early, we understand. But for those of you that hang with us, we appreciate it. Also, when you close out of the webinar today, there's an opportunity for you to take a survey. Each one of these individual webinars have a survey to help us evaluate how the day went and what our participants might have learned on that. And this is different from the original survey that you took at the very beginning when you registered for this webinar. Let's see, other than that, Jason, did we get everything?
Yep, I believe so. I think we're ready.
All right. Okay, so today we're going to start in Utah, and then we're going to swing back over into Oregon and come back across Idaho and back down into Utah. So I'd like to take this opportunity to introduce our first speaker today, Dr. Earl Creech. Earl Creech is a professor and extension agronomist at Utah State University. Earl grew up on a family livestock and crop production farm near Logan, Utah, and received his BS and MS degrees from Utah State University before earning his PhD at Purdue University. He spent 3 years at the University of Nevada, Reno as an extension weed specialist before accepting his current position at Utah State University. In his research and extension efforts, Earl works to address critical agronomic issues facing farmers and ranchers in Utah and throughout the Western United States. So Earl, welcome and thank you.
State University. We are in Snowville, Utah today. It's right near the Utah-Idaho border, and we're going to talk about. Hi, I'm Earl Creech, extension agronomist at Utah State University. We are in Snowville, Utah today. It's right near the Utah-Idaho border, and we're going to talk about dryland wheat. This area is representative of many dryland wheat growing areas in Utah because it is very low in precip. So low, in fact, that it's pretty marginal as to whether it makes sense to grow a crop here or not. And growers in these situations often find themselves with a dilemma in that yields are so low that it's hard to afford fertility inputs in order to grow a better crop, get higher yields, and to maintain quality. And so as a result, over time, the yields and crop quality tend to slowly and steadily decline to the point that it becomes difficult for a person to stay in business. A lot of the growers in these situations have chosen to move into the organic markets because they can't afford to put synthetic inputs in terms of weed control or fertility in anyway. And he has going on, or that he has hosted on his farm. The first trial that we're going to look at here in Snowville is a fertility trial looking at the effects of compost applied at very high rates and the effect that that has on subsequent wheat yield and quality. And so this was done with composted steer manure, and the original compost application was applied back in 1994. And so what happened was David Hull and one of his graduate students went out. They made the application. It was 22 tons of dry weight per acre. So it was a fairly high rate of compost. And the yield effects were measured from that one-time compost application for a couple of years. They sat down, they ran the stats and economics on the whole situation, and discovered, yeah, we got triple the yield by applying compost, but economically it was a loser. It didn't make a whole lot of sense, and so the project was scrapped. So then we fast forward to 2007, 2008. Jennifer Reeve came to USU as an organic person, and she got wind of this trial and wanted to follow up on it and see how, if there's been any long-term effects of that one application of compost. And so she pulled it up on Google Earth to try to figure out where the trial was, and lo and behold, it was visible from a satellite in outer space. It was still apparent even all those years later that there was something different about those little squares where the compost was applied. They really stood out, and they wanted to go investigate further. So they came back to the original site, which is right here where we're standing, and triangulated. There's one of them back there behind me. And we're able to reestablish the trial back to its original form, and went in and measured yields. And they found that all those years later, from 1994 to 2008, the yields were still double from that one compost application. Now, ever since then, we followed this, and we're just getting ready to harvest the 2020 edition today, and I'm going to show you what that looks like. And even up until the present day, that 1994 application of 22 tons per acre of compost has doubled the yield every year since. And so that changes the economics of this whole situation. If we can do this one time and reap the rewards of it for many years to come, maybe it makes a little bit more sense when we look at it on a larger scale instead of just that abbreviated scale that we were doing before. So with that, let's go ahead and we'll move over and I'll show you what some of these treatments look like today. So here are the trials. It is the 16th of July, 2020. We're just getting ready to harvest this trial. We've cut around the trial with a commercial combine, and now we'll go in with our small plot combine to take the yields. But let's go ahead and look at some of these individual treatments. So this treatment is 22 tons of compost per acre, dry weight, that was applied back in 1994. No additional compost has been applied since, and we're just getting a residual effect from that original compost application. Take a look at the wheat. You can see the size of it. It's good looking wheat for this area, really nice looking wheat for this area. You'll see that we have a terrific stand, plenty of tillering, good plant population. The plants themselves look really good, and it's going to yield quite nicely. One of the things that we're seeing with compost applications, one of the benefits of compost application, is in stand establishment. And if you look at the soils here and the soils in most dryland wheat growing areas of Utah, the soil becomes just as hard as a rock as soon as it sees any type of moisture, leading to crusting issues, emergence issues, and problems in terms of how that translates into stands. And with compost, you're adding some organic matter, you're breaking that crust up, and we do tend to get better crop emergence in the compost treated areas. Another benefit that we see from compost is that it tends to hold some more moisture. That moisture can then become available to the crop later on in the season. And so that helps us to get better yields, especially in these moisture limited areas such as this. And then finally, the last thing that compost tends to do is it creates a little bit darker tint to the soil. It makes it darker in color, that attracts the radiation of the sun a little bit better, causes it to stay a little bit warmer in the fall, warm up a little bit better in the spring, and take better advantage of some of that winter moisture and a little bit longer season growth, I think, because of that. So we'll contrast the compost treated area with this. This is the untreated check. No compost was applied here back 25 years ago. And you can see what the wheat would look like naturally without a compost amendment. So the stand here tends to be just a little bit thinner. The plants are shorter and the heads are smaller. And this is mostly going to be the effect of not getting quite as good emergence, not getting quite as good a growth early in the season, and then being a little bit more moisture limited later on in the year. But we'll be driving a combine through here in the next, probably in the next 30 minutes or so, and we'll be able to actually measure the yields. But really we're looking at yields that are probably going to be half, maybe even a little bit more than half yields here in the untreated check versus what we saw earlier that it had compost applied at 22 tons to the acre. So we know that compost works. That we know that if we go in with a really high rate of compost, that we can achieve a beneficial result, and that's a good thing. But from the standpoint of being practical, 22 tons to the acre dry weight is an awful lot of compost, and pretty much is not going to fly in a commercial setting. So we've set up the trial that you see behind us. About 5 years ago this all began, and what we're looking at here is if we can cut the rate of compost from 22 down to 11 and then down to about 5 or 6 tons to the acre, and still receive a positive result. Our hope is that we can apply a lower rate and get an equal benefit to the high rate. That would be great, because then we can apply a quarter of the compost and get just as much benefit out of it. But that's what we're testing here. The other thing that we wanted to test was if it might be possible to use cover crops as a substitute for compost. We all know that recently there's been an awful lot of interest in cover crops. These organic producers are interested in them, and so we're going to test them out here to see how they affect the production of dryland wheat in these situations. So let's go take a look. So these are fairly large plots from a research standpoint. So we've got 25 feet wide by about 75 feet long, 80 feet long. You can see we've taken a swath right out of the middle with our small harvester, and we still have some area over here to the side that we can take a look at and try to learn something from. So this is 22 tons to the acre compost applied one time. It was applied in 2015, so it's now it's now in its third harvest time, and it looks very similar to what we see in those long-term plots. You got good looking heads, you've got a good tillering, you got a really nice stand, and the yields are going to be nice. Let's go look at the lower rates now. So this is 11 tons to the acre, and the heads are just a little bit smaller. The stand is just a little bit thinner. the tillering is just a little bit less. So it's about half the rate of compost, and we're seeing, certainly seeing less wheat growth here. Here's the 5 to 6 ton to the acre treatment, and we're seeing even a thinner stand, less tillering, and smaller heads, and it'll certainly yield less. And here is the 0, the untreated check, and we have a much thinner stand, little to no tillering, and the heads are just tiny. A lot of open canopy, a lot of yield potential that has been left behind here. So when we started out in this project, we were hoping that we could drop from a high rate to half or a quarter of that amount and get a similar result. But what we have found is that it looks like the relationship is pretty linear. If you apply a high rate of compost, you get the most yield. If you apply less compost, you get a lower yield. And if you apply less than that, you get less still. And so, unfortunately, it seems like in order to get the best yield benefit, we do need to go with the high rate. But there is still certainly a benefit from going from this with 0 to even a 5 or a 6 ton rate. You can boost your yield substantially. So now let's talk about cover crops. What you're looking at is 22 tons to the acre compost with no cover crop. So now I'm going to move 10 feet to the right, right next door, and I'm going to show you what the exact same rate of compost looks like with cover crops. Totally amazing, isn't it? What we see consistently when we try compost or cover crops in dryland crops in Utah is this scenario. Here we grew hairy vetch and winter pea. It was planted as a frost seeding, a dormant seeding, so it was planted about Thanksgiving time, went into the winter as a seed, and germinated as early as it could in the spring as temperatures started to warm and the ice melted. And we were able to, and we allowed it to grow until about the mid part of June, and then we went in with tillage and terminated it. And then in the fall, we came in and planted the wheat. And so essentially what we did is we substituted the fallow period with a cover crop, and it has just completely annihilated the yield. So really tough thing. I mean, even if the cover crops are small when they're terminated, they're still using some water, and that little bit of water that they're using goes an awful long way to making a big difference in the yield. So we still haven't figured out the puzzle of how to grow cover crops in Utah dryland. We've got some new ideas that we're going to try, but just to straight up go into the fallow period, seed a cover crop, terminate it, and plant wheat following it. It seems to be a great recipe for having a significant yield reduction. I think most of you know that I'm a weed scientist by training, and I love a good field of weeds, and I love a good opportunity to explore the latest and greatest in weed management techniques and chemistries. And so one of the things that's amazing about this is we are on an organic farm that doesn't see a sniff of herbicides of any kind. And I want you to take a look in between the rows of this wheat, how clean that is. I mean, that is just as clean as can be. And I'd like to say that there's some magic here, or something special that's been done, but really it's it's entirely because of the fact that this is a low precip area. After about April, this place sees no moisture at all, and as long as you get a good stand of wheat, does a really good job of keeping the weeds suppressed. They just don't get enough moisture to even grow weeds. So here you manipulate the crop to get a great looking crop, and you have the weeds that don't really have a chance to grow due to low moisture conditions, and pretty amazing. But that's just a side note on the weeds, just because I like weeds. So one of the challenges with doing dryland research in Utah is that the dryland here is run on a wheat fallow system, which means that we grow a crop every other year, and we use tillage or herbicides to control weeds and to save up moisture in the off year. And so in order to speed that up from a research standpoint, we have a trial that's in wheat this year on one side of the road, and then we'll cross the road, and we have the exact same trial that's currently in fallow on the other side of the road. So we'll go take a look at that now. So we're out here in the fallow area now, and as you can imagine, there's not a whole lot to see. But in order to be successful in organic production, you got to do a really good job on your fallow season weed control, and Richard Grover here does a wonderful job with that. And now we're over in the cover crop area, and you can see some of the cover crop skeletons in the fallow, and they are breaking down in the soil and getting ready to try to grow a productive crop of wheat in the spring. Just found a few cover crop escapees that must have gone between shanks on the tillage equipment. And you can see this is our vetch, and then here is our pea. This is mid-July, and so you can see how short all of these grow, and it's just because we're so moisture limited in this environment. But these were planted in March. So there we have it. That's our virtual tour of the Snowville Dryland Wheat Project. Hope you enjoyed it. Appreciate the cooperation of Richard Grover and his crew. They've been outstanding to work with, and they continue to put up with us. But if you ever want to come and take a look at this in person, feel free to give me a holler, and we'll bring you out and show you around in real life. So thanks. Bye.
All right. Thanks, Earl. And I see that there's some questions in the chat box, and I believe that Earl is answering those right now himself. He did double book his time this afternoon, so he'll answer questions as he can, but he'll have to go here pretty quick because I know that he has another commitment. So interesting, coming from someone who lives in irrigated ag country. All right, so now we're going to leave the Snowville country of Utah, and we are going to head over to South Central Oregon. And there are actually 3 presenters involved there, and I will introduce them, and then we'll turn that over for video as well. So the first is Farah Brummer. She is faculty research assistant with the Oregon State University Extension Department of Animal and Rangeland Sciences since October 2016. She has a master's in animal science and rangeland ecology and management. Currently, her research projects are focused on restoration potential of arid and irrigated ground. Prior to this, she worked with North Dakota State University, where she was involved in cover cropping for soil health and extending the grazing season. She lives with her family in Paisley, Oregon. She's going to be talking about a program that she's done with a producer, John Shine, who is a custom grazer in Lake County, Oregon, where he grew up. He left for 35 years and returned to purchase his grandparents' ranch, where he currently operates 1,000 acres of irrigated ground, 9 pivots, and grazes 700 head of cattle during the growing season. He is working on restoring his family ranch, which had fallen into a state of disrepair. And then Farah is also going to be presenting a presentation for one of her colleagues, Dr. Sirkin Addies. Dr. Addies holds a PhD in pasture agronomy from Lincoln University in New Zealand and a Master of Science in Feeds and Animal Feeding from Süleyman Demirel University in Turkey. Before joining OSU, Dr. Addies was a forage and pasture scientist in the International Center for Agricultural Research. In his position, he conducted a number of multidisciplinary crop livestock research studies and managed projects in North Africa, West Asia, and Central Asia regions. He joined Oregon State University as assistant professor of forage livestock systems in the Department of Animal and Rangeland Sciences in September of 2016. So welcome, Farah. Take us to Oregon.
All right, thank you very much there, Steve. Actually, we're in Southeast Oregon. I'm going to show a little map in the next slide. But to start with, can you see the PowerPoint up there on your screen?
Yes,
Yes.
we can. You need to click display settings.
Display settings, okay. What do I do there? Swap center.
Yes, swap. Yeah, do that.
That better?
It's loading. I'm trying to see what it's doing. Yep, that's better.
Oh, good. Thank you. I can uncross my fingers and toes now. I'm not still learning the technology. So thank you, everybody. This is great to be here with you, even though it's through a screen. And this is going to be a pretty whirlwind tour because I'll kick us off with introducing our project here, which was a Western SARE funded project. John Shine, who is in the picture there with the cowboy hat, is our feature producer, and he received a farmer rancher grant. And so he came to myself and Sirkin and asked us to help him regenerate his degraded pasture, which is what we're talking about. He wanted to do it cost effectively, and he really wanted to introduce these cover crops in his perennial pasture. And many of these cover crops are what we consider novel, newer forages for us in this country, but they can really boost grazing quality and also soil health. And these were two of his goals. So if you can see that picture up there, that's Lake County, Oregon. And much like I think a lot of the country in which our participants live and work in, it's high desert, it's high elevation, low precip zone. Growing degree days are about, we have frost-free period about 100 days. So it's very, very short that we have soil temperatures that are conducive to keeping plants, forage plants growing and productive. And our primary ag production system is beef cattle production. So arid lands dominate our landscape, but the irrigated grounds that we also have support that, that cattle industry. And they provide a great opportunity for cover crops. So, 16% of our private land is irrigated. And the estimated dry matter tons for native grass, about 2 tons and 3 tons per acre for cereal grain production on these lands. With the use of other forage species, we could potentially produce 10% more dry matter forage, resulting in higher dry matter tons per acre and supporting potentially an additional 80 to 128 AUMs for a quarter section pivot. So these are really alluring goals when we look at them. In the picture in front of you, hopefully you can see 2 slides. And the one on your left is our brassicas that we put in as a treatment. And I'll show you our design pattern in a couple of slides here, but you can see those little brassicas that are emerging in our drill rows. And that was over drilled into John's perennial pasture, his existing perennial pasture. And then on the right, you see one of our really great crops that we got a lot out of, and this is Berseem clover. So it's a worm-loving species, and it did very well in this particular field. So, why do we want this opportunity to improve these degraded perennial systems? Well, it's costly to dig up and replant perennial pasture. And there are many of them around this country and probably into the Western rangelands that could be improved just by putting in cover crops. One of the drawbacks of these perennial pastures is that they're nitrogen limited. So they're typically cool season producing pastures, cool season grasses in them. They're nitrogen limited. And in this particular pasture that you're looking at, Kentucky bluegrass had taken over. And some of you have probably dealt with Kentucky bluegrass. It's highly rhizomatous and can be quite aggressive. And it had really taken over that A horizon in the soil, impacting water infiltration and soil moisture holding capacity. So we had heard Dr. Yost talk about this last Thursday, and I appreciated it, that increasing organic matter can potentially change that. It can potentially increase also soil moisture holding capacity. And John had recognized this. And so really his goals for putting in these cover crops were to not only increase his grazing days and his quality, but also his soil health, thereby decreasing his irrigation cost. So this is what we did as part of this Western Sierra project. And this was our first year. We worked on his 22-acre pivot, and we divided that up into quadrats, so 4 pieces. And then within each piece, we had 3 treatments, and our 4th was a control. And we randomized those treatments and controls within the pivot system. And this is kind of the fun part. This was our seeding mixes, our methods, and the dates in which we did this. So this was very much a learning year for us doing this. We went ahead and initially seeded in early spring. So if you look at that table, May 5th and 6th is when we first put the cover crops in the different treatments. And we did add fertilizer with that. We really did that for the cover crop mixes themselves. We didn't add a very high rate. We just added about 4 pounds of nitrogen per acre. So very, very low rate. But you can see our diverse mix was our treatment 1, cool season grasses, some forbs, and then 2 clovers that can tolerate warm temperatures pretty well. Treatment 2 was our cover crop mix, kale, radish, and forage oats. And treatment 3 was our clover base. What you could think of is our legume base mix with a mix of clovers. We had trefoil, sandfoin, and emetic in there. So a mixture of annual and perennial legumes. And we went ahead and seeded those in with a Great Plains drill. We interseeded into that perennial pasture, and we had a complete failure. So you learn by your mistakes, right? And so John, being an optimist, said, let's go ahead and try this again. And so we did in July 17th. But it was a great learning opportunity for us. We did have our seeds germinate and come up, but they just did not persist. And the reason is our timing was completely off. So that was the big lesson that we learned that we wanted to share with you guys, is that timing is very, very key, very critical when you're working with these over-drilled pastures. So what had happened was the cool season grasses had continued to grow and overwhelm our drilled mixes. Now, I need to tell you also that all of these pastures, or all of these treatments, in the pasture were grazed before we went in and drilled. And they were grazed about 3 to 4 inches stubble height. Our goal was not to preserve the existing perennial grasses, but to obviously outcompete them. So we grazed a little bit lower than we normally would. But in spite of that, the cooler temperatures in the pasture and the additional fertilizer that those perennial grasses hadn't seen before, just caused them to shoot back up, and they overwhelmed our drilled mixes. So we went back in July 17th, we modified our treatment somewhat, and you can see the modifications in that table there. We put in the 2 forbs and the clovers in our treatment 1. We swapped out our forage oats for a warm season Sudan grass and added a vetch in treatment 2. And treatment 3, we didn't put in the trefoil. It's very expensive seed, as some of you know. So we left that out, and we took the medic out as well. And this time we had great success. So this time the forages really came on, and they came on strong, some definitely better than others. And John and Sirkin will talk more about that. But this July 17th seeding was definitely a success. I put in there also in 2017, we seeded bird's foot trefoil in this pivot. And the reason I'm putting that in is because we saw the fruit of it this year. It wasn't part of our project this year, obviously, but the seeding that we had done in June, on June 13th of 2017 really came to life this year. And in fact, that bird's foot trefoil was extremely lush and thick and provided a great forage as well, complementary forage in this pasture. Let's see, with that, I'm gonna leave the field results for Sirkin and John to discuss. But one of the things that happened after we did this project was John was able to graze 92 cow-calf pairs for a week in the fall, and very much enjoy that heightened grazing quality that he got from our interseeded forages. So with that, we're going to go to video with John Shine. If you could go ahead and start that video, Jason. I'll go ahead and mute myself here.
Hey, we're out here with John Shine, producer and livestock operator in Lake County. And John is an innovative producer. He has actually taken it upon himself to seed in supplementary forages, novel, what we call cover crops. And John, do you have a few comments on this year's experience?
Well, we've got a field here that I was here when I got the ranch, and it's got a lot of intermediate wheatgrass, and it does really good early in the year. And then once we get into 90 degrees in July, I can pour the water to it and it stays green, but it doesn't grow anymore. So I wanted to try something in this hot part of the summer to see what I can do to keep cattle grazing out here. And so we planted a bunch of cover crops this year, and we planted first in May, but we fertilized it, and it made the existing stuff grow so fast that all our cover crops didn't amount to anything. But we got a good crop of our base mix, but then we came back in the middle of, I guess, the July 15th and replanted again a bunch of cover crops. And it's been now, what, 2 or 3 weeks, and I'm impressed. I mean, these annuals, some of these, the Sudan grass is coming in great, some of the plantains and radishes. And our goal is also to get this soil to have more organic matter in it, so that we can hold moisture better. So I'm very excited about some of these vegetable type plants that have like a radish or a turnip, and some of these that will help us build our organic matter, and also getting some of these clovers with deep roots. And so I'm excited. And already on this grow, we're getting a good germination, and it's exciting. So let's see where it goes.
So John, the main goal is to increase your grazing days. And do you think and we'll find out at the end of the year, but do you think that's actually going to happen this year?
Well, I mean, normally right now I would have just turned this pivot off once it gets 90 degrees and just leave it off the rest of the year, because it doesn't even pay the electric bill. It keeps it green, but it doesn't grow. And what I'm seeing here is some real growth. I mean, that Sudan grass is just taken off. So we're probably turning cows in here towards the middle end of September, and I think we're going to have a pretty big crop here. Whereas otherwise we'd have nothing. So yeah,
great.
Absolutely.
And then what are all these yellow flowers here? Can you tell us what's going on here right where we are right now?
Well, this gal named Farah showed up here a couple years ago and said she wanted to mess with some seeds, and I said, well, I'll give you, I think it was about an acre then.
Yeah.
And so she planted this bird's-foot trefoil in here, and at first I thought the whole thing was a waste of time because it didn't really grow. But 3 years later, where we're standing right now is where Farah planted the bird's-foot trefoil, and it's the dominant plant here. So it just took a while. It's about 3 years to get here, but the first year she was here, I thought that was a waste of time. But we're standing in it right now, and it's the dominant plant, and it fixes nitrogen, and cattle love it. So yeah.
And also John made a good observation that it is a nitrogen fixer. The plants around it are quite green, and even some of the Sudan grass that typically doesn't look as lush as we would like it to, in this spot has some more green to it. So that kind of confirms this is the Sudan grass that was planted without nitrogen, and you can see it is growing, but it's lacking in nitrogen. But in this trefoil stand, we have Sudan grass that's actually looking relatively green and lush. So the whole idea of this is to increase grazing options, grazing days, grazing quality also. That's something we don't think about with cattle so much. Or I was thinking biomass. It's how we base our AUMs. We don't think quality so much. And this is a higher level of quality for these grazing cattle, especially middle, end of summer, like John is saying. So thank you, John. We sure appreciate all your efforts, and this is an exciting project.
It is exciting. So we'll hopefully be turning a bunch of cattle in here in into September, and they'll be swishing their tails and gaining weight in here. So
Thank you.
And if you could start the grazing cows video, Jason. So like I mentioned, middle of summer, middle of September, John turned 92 cow-calf pairs out. And they went to town. You'll see in the data that Sirkin is showing that unfortunately we did not see a significant difference in biomass with treatment versus control. Part of this is because we went ahead and planted so late. If we had planted 2 to 4 weeks earlier, let's say mid-June, which is what we would suggest and what we're going to try this next year, we may have seen a difference in growth of treatment versus control. The other reason is just time. So we expect that this pasture will improve with time and will continue to produce some of those perennial forages that we seeded, continue to produce more in treatment area versus control. Sometimes it's just nice to see the ruminants on the landscape utilizing the forage and recycling it back onto the field. So with that, I'm going to go back to my slideshow and wrap up with Sirkin's slides. And I'm not quite sure how to do that. But maybe you could help me out, Jason?
You need to share screen again.
Share screen again. Share screen again, and this one, share. Does that look okay?
You want to do the display settings again.
Display settings, okay. Good?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. So we'll just go into the last series of slides here, and I'm gonna push this button and hopefully you'll hear Sirkin talking.
We can't hear him. You're going to need to stop your share, and you're going to need to make sure you're sharing audio.
Oh gosh, I'm sorry, guys. I'm learning technology as we go here. Screen share. I will go back here and do the sound. And now this should work.
And quality decreases due to agroecological and management factors. Overall, when the pastures lose 40 or 50% of their potential production and their desirable plant species, it may be a good idea to consider renovating the pastures. Newly established pastures generally provide more desirable forages with higher metabolizable energy content. The carrying capacity of the pastures can be increased tremendously. Higher forage production, together with increased feeding value of pastures, would be reflected in more milk production and rapid weight gains of the cattle. Hello everyone, this is Serkan Ateş. Old pastures are characterized with low legume contents and poor feeding values. Depending on the pasture conditions and our farming capacity from the availability of the equipment perspective, pastures can be renovated from the scratch after tearing up and working the ground, or can be overseeded with mix of grass and forb species. If the pastures are severely or partially damaged and contain lots of weeds and a lot of bare ground, then total renovation is preferred. Old pastures are In renovation of pastures, one of the most critical decisions is the choice of pasture species that are compatible and will persist multiple years, producing high-quality forages. Overall, grass-clover pasture mix form the basis of low-input production systems. Maintaining 20 or 30% of legume content in pasture is a good target. We prefer including legumes from both agronomic and feeding value perspective in our pasture mixtures. In pastoral systems, nitrogen is the most limiting factor for the plant growth and forage production. In particular, legumes with their symbiotic relationships with the soil bacteria, they can fix atmospheric nitrogen in their roots. White clover, for example, alone can fix up to 300 pounds of nitrogen per acre annually. As you could follow from the graph, legumes in pastures with additional moderate amount of fertilizer can double the forage production as compared to grass-dominated unfertilized pastures. It is important to know that most temperate cool season grass species are nitrogen deficient and go dormant in summer, even if the irrigation is available. Legumes also provide forages with superior feeding value and help improving the efficiency in grass-fed or pasture-based livestock production systems. Overall, higher the legume content of pastures, greater the live weight gains of the cattle. Dr. Mark Adams' study from Utah State University indicated that birchwood trefoil can be a highly effective forage crop in pasture-based finishing systems. In her study, cattle that grazed birchwood trefoil as compared to those grazed grasses had greater live weight gains. Most importantly, the dressing percentages were significantly higher for the birchwood trefoil finished steers than for either feedlot finished or grass finished steers. So the carcass weights of birchwood trefoil finished steers were similar to grain finished steers and higher than grass finished steers. I highly recommend her article published in Hay and Forage magazine, which I provided the link in this slide as well. As far I explained before, bearing all these points and benefits of legumes in mind, we wanted to test the potential of overseeding some annual and perennial forage mixtures for their effects on pasture production and forage nutritive value in a high desert area in Lakeview. Basically, John's irrigated pastures were grass-dominated and highly nitrogen deficient. His pasture production in summer was particularly disappointing even under irrigated conditions. This is in fact not a surprise to me, as most of these cool season grasses require high nitrogen to produce forages, and even if the soil moisture conditions are ideal, due to high temperatures in summer, they go dormant. From these perspectives, he needed to increase both legume contents and diversity of his pastures. I'm not going to repeat the establishment details or the mixtures that we used in this study, but I will talk about our initial observations and our preliminary results. First of all, botanical composition of the pastures. In mid-September, when we harvested the forages, indicated that our establishment on forb and legume mixtures were very successful. At the initial stage, we were able to increase the legume content of the pastures up to 15%. While the dry matter yield of pastures at the establishment phase didn't change much, there was a small response of crude protein. When we looked at the area that were overseeded with burswood trefoil in summer 2007 and compared the quantity and quality of the forages, the results were impressive. In these areas, the legume content of the pastures were over 40% and the forage yield was doubled. More importantly, the quality of the forage was far superior with low fiber and high crude protein content exceeding 20%. This already proves the potential of overseeding and shows us where we will be heading with our newly established pasture mixtures. As far as
And that is it. That's our tour. So thank you for bearing with us through all the technological bumps. And we will turn it back over to you, Steve. One last request is that I will put a link in the chat box, and this is for another survey. Sorry, we don't want to kill you by over surveying, but these surveys really help us to do a better job. So if you could click on that link, it'll ask you just to rate the first part of this presentation, and the results will be really helpful for us. So with that, I'll just turn it over to you, Steve, and thank you all for listening and participating.
All right, thanks, Farah. And could you check the question and answer box? I see that there's a couple of questions in there, and I'm not sure if they're for you or for Sirkin. If they're for Sirkin, could you please drop his email in the chat box so that those questions can be forwarded on? Okay, this next presentation, we're coming out of Oregon and heading into south central Idaho. And myself, along with some of my colleagues, will be presenting on this little field tour. We're actually going to show you some short snippets of several projects that we've been working on. And so immediately the co-presenters and the videographers for this bit of work is Jason Thomas. And you've heard us talk to Jason already today. He's the one behind the technology. Jason is an extension educator with the University of Idaho over in Minidoka County. He is an entomologist by training. And if you want to see some really neat and fun insect-related videos, check out his YouTube channel, Insect Hunter. And the other presenter is Grant Loomis. Grant is a graduate from the University of Idaho. He worked in private industry in the seed production before joining the University of Idaho about a year ago, and he is up in Blaine County, where we are going to start today. And to give you just a little bit of background on this particular project, this is a producer that we've worked with quite a bit. He actually happens to be on the webinar today. And one of the questions that he's trying to answer here is, can he plant in the springtime a winter wheat crop mixed with cover crop, graze the cover crop, and then form a cereals crop the next year? Can he plant a cover crop mix with seeded in it, graze that cover crop season long and get the income off of that cover crop, and then have the winter wheat go through the winter and come back next spring and produce a viable cereal crop. And so that's really what we're looking at here. And one of the questions came up when the cattle first came onto this particular 20-acre piece early on. The producer had a lot of cattle spread everywhere, so the cattle were pretty well able to eat whatever they want, and they really liked that wheat component. And they grazed it fairly significantly, and the producer was pretty concerned about whether or not the wheat was even going to regrow and come back. And so as we take a look at this piece of wheat here, at this one plant, you can see that it is starting to regrow, put on some new leaves. Now this is winter wheat, understand, planted in the spring, so it did not vernalize. So this is not going to elongate the shoots. It's not going to go reproductive this summer. And that's the whole point of this particular study. So we're getting some new regrowth. You can see on these stems here where they were grazed previously, but this winter wheat was small enough that the growth point was still down in the crown. It wasn't up high like you would see in something that had started to elongate, was going reproductive, where the cows would come in and eat the reproductive piece off. They basically just grazed this like they would any kind of a perennial grass and then moved on. And you can see that this wheat is coming back pretty well, and this is actually a nice looking field now of winter wheat with a lot of brassica still mixed through it. Now the grower will come back in and they'll graze this particular piece 2 or 3 more times yet this year, and then get the cattle off of it so that the wheat isn't overgrazed and it has plenty of energy going into the winter. And these are fairly significant winters up here in this valley. High elevation, cold, can be significant amounts of snow. And I think it shows a lot of potential to get 2 cash crops essentially off of a single planting. And the other thing is that in this particular area, this field had been barley for 3 years in a row after it had come out of alfalfa. I mean, they're pretty much rotation crop limited to alfalfa, barley, and then perennial pasture up here, and trying to find something else that'll work, that'll be profitable for the grower, add the soil health component, and break up some of the same crop on crop issues is going to only benefit the growers and all the growers throughout this valley.
Big almond production area. Yeah. For a year and
But he grazed this whole 20 acres for a couple days. He's got about 100, and he had about 100, at that time I think 35 head, cow-calf pairs I should say, 135 pairs out here. He was grazing the entire thing, and then based on the suggestions of the university folks, he did split the field in half, and he put, actually that's about 1/3, 2/3, about where that wheel line is. If you walk over there, you'll see there's a line. He grazed that side of it, I'd say like 90%. I mean, it was to the ground. The wheat was. They took the wheat right to the ground, and I thought we probably had lost that because I didn't figure it would regrow. He took this, I would say, I don't know, Steve, what would you say? Maybe 60 to 75%. I mean, he grazed this pretty hard too, but not quite as hard as that other side. This has been 10, 12 days of regrowth from a very hard grazing.
Starting heavy right now when this is growing great guns. Later it's going to slow down, especially these cool season grasses, and so you've got to be able to bring in enough cows initially and then adjust those numbers throughout the growing season so that you've got enough to get it early, but you're not beating it down later in the season, especially on a deal like this if you're going to try and come back with a grain.
Like after 3 days they're going to come and hit it again, especially the winter wheat, and so trying to move them in those 3-day rotations would be better, because then they're not going to come back and eat the same thing they ate 3 days ago. Is if he manages it right, he could wean the calves in October whenever he weans, and then bring them back and put his calves out here for a little while too. To me, it'd be really good feed to put weaned calves on, and they've already been exposed to it, so I wouldn't be so worried about bloat or any of those issues. When I've seen rashes in turnips, that the cows really like. They like to eat it in the fall after they freeze a little, and then they'll pull these out and eat them. And so it'll be interesting to see what they do as the season progresses. They might actually start come and cherry pick these out of the field instead of the oats. Once they start to frost a little bit, then they get sweeter. Right now they're a little spicier.
All right, thanks, Jason. And I had mentioned in there that that was high elevation. It's about 4,850 feet, something about like that, up at that particular farm. So we're going to move south now and look at another little study that we've got going. One of the questions, we started working about 4 years ago with a particular producer, and they were interseeding cover crop into their pivots of corn. And that corn was on 22-inch rows. And through that study, you know, it works, and they've done well with it. And I had been doing some reading on some wide row work that they had been doing in other parts of the country. And most of the corn grown here in this valley is for silage. Maybe 10 or 15% goes for grain. And so we started asking the question, can we grow silage corn on wide rows, not hurt the yield, and have a good viable either grazing cover crop or soil armor type cover crop when that silage comes off in September? And so we set up this little study, and it has 3 treatments. We used a standard 30-inch row on center as the check, which is pretty common around here, either 30s or 22s. We chose 30s with no cover crop interseeded. And then we did twin rows. One treatment was twin rows on 60-inch centers, and the other was twin rows on 44-inch centers. And so everything was planted at the same population, approximately 40,000 plants per acre was our goal. And so Jason will run this little video here, and you can kind of watch this grow through the growing season. This was planted, the corn was planted on May 8th. It's a 99-day corn. And so here we are in July 22nd. The cover crop was planted on June 26th, and I just used a chest type fertilizer spreader to spread this out across the field, kind of simulate what would happen if you were to fly it on, which several producers in this area do. And the seed wasn't worked in at all, just sprinkler irrigated, just let the sprinkler drops kind of work that seed into the ground a little bit. We think we need to improve on that. And here you can see as we're getting into the middle of August that cover crop's really starting to come. That cover crop mix, it was put on about 25 pounds to the acre, and it consisted of crimson clover, yellow sweet clover, a radish, and an annual ryegrass. And as you look at this, I mean, there's certainly some weeds in there, but not anything like I thought it would be. Now, this was a Roundup Ready technology, and so we did apply glyphosate actually twice before seeding down the cover crop. And we did our harvest on September 18th. And so here we are a week or two before harvest. And you can see whether the 44 or 60, that's really started to cover in the control up there at the top right. I mean, there's a few weeds in there, but there's just not much on that soil, as opposed to our wide row stuff has really got a lot of material growing in there. That soil's covered. There's a lot of potential feed in there. And so here we are on September 14th, which would have been 4 days before we came in and harvested this. This is the first year of this study. We're going to do it again this next year. This study was conducted at the Kimberly Research and Extension Center farm. We're doing it small scale before trying to move it out onto a producer's pivot to upscale it a little bit and see how it works in the real world. So here we are after harvest, and this would have been about a week or so. And you can see, Jason, you want to stop that video just a second? You can see there on the top right corner there where it was just a standard 30-inch row, no cover crop. That soil is open. There's some weeds in there, but not much else. But you can see whether it's on the 60-inch centers or the 44-inch centers that there's some material in there. You could graze that, or that soil is already armored. We have some pretty strong winds in this area, and soil erosion is a concern. You can go ahead and play it. And I did take forage clippings before harvest, and I'll talk about those results here in just a minute when we get to the end of this video. But I think it's very telling, especially for those of you who are interested in the soil health and soil armor aspect of cover crops. Now here we are at the end of, go ahead and stop that, Jason. So here we are at the end of September or end of October. It has frozen several days by this point in time, but you can see that field with the 30-inch, the check treatment there is just open. There's just nothing there. The weeds that were growing there are froze out. So there's essentially nothing there to graze, and there's nothing there to protect that soil. There's nothing there to catch the snow like we're getting here today, actually. But you can see whether it was 22s, or excuse me, the 44-inch on center or the 60s on center, that there's stuff there. You could graze that, or you certainly have good soil armor heading into winter. Go ahead. Let's go ahead and finish the video now, Jason. So I'm really excited about what we learned the first year as far as setting this up. And I think it really has some potential, especially if you were looking at, you could even graze that and then still have some soil armor as you're heading into the winter, depending on how you manage that. So quickly, just talk about the results and what we found on that. So the standard 30-inch check on that field averaged, and all of this was moisture corrected to 30% dry matter or 70% water, which is kind of the harvest target. So that check yielded 30.7 tons. The 60-inch on center yielded 27.1 tons. And the 22-inch, or excuse me, the 44-inch on center yielded 34.7 ton. So from the statistical analysis, there is a significant difference between the 44-inch on center and the 60-inch on center, but neither of those are significantly different from the check, which fell kind of right in the middle of them, which was interesting. I can't really explain yet why the 22s would do better than the 44 or the 60s. The 44s would have done better than the 60s. In my mind, I thought that they would get more sunlight, more solar energy, kind of spaced out a little bit more. But again, this is 1 year worth of data, and we'll see what happens again this next year. The cover crop part of that deal on the 60-inch center was, and now this is dry matter, 0.91 tons to the acre. And on the 44-inch, no, we're not there yet, Jason. On the 44-inch was 0.58 tons to the acre. But there was enough variance between the individual plots that there showed that there was no insignificant difference. But again, that's on a dry matter basis, keep in mind. So, somewhere, if you're kind of average those out, somewhere about 3/4 of a ton per acre dry matter of either feed or definitely some soil armor headed into the winter. So that's kind of what we found on that one this year. Interesting, and looking forward to studying this out this next year. So the final piece that we're going to look at today is another little study. Maybe before you start that, let me quickly introduce this. The same producer from the first video, we'd worked with him, I don't know, geez, 3 or 4 years ago on another project. And one of the questions coming out of all of that, without getting too far off in the weeds, as it were, is how much regrowth, if you're grazing cool season cereals in a cover crop mix planted in the spring and you're grazing those all summer, how much regrowth can you actually get out of those cool season cereals? And it seemed like the traditional school of thought was, well, once they start to elongate those stems, and they're going to be done. And we really didn't know. So we set up quite a study, and you're going to see just the very end of this. This was a 2-year study conducted at 2 different research centers for the university, one high elevation at the research ranch up in Salmon, and then also at the research farm at Kimberly. And so we decided our treatments were to cut them 1 time a year, 2 times, 3 times, and 4 times, just to simulate maybe some different kinds of grazing practices that you might see. What we're going to look here is the last cutting of the 3 cut and the 4 cut, just to kind of look how those cereals look later in the season. Now, these are not in mixes, they're individual species. Keep in mind that the whole idea of this is to see how they might function in a mix. So go ahead and play the video, Jason. Thank you. So you've got a bar up in front of the title there. Can you, on your computer there, Jason, can you close that? Thanks. So on the triticale here, one thing we found is once triticale wants to try to go to boot and then seed, it just wants to be done. Triticale worked really well if you wanted to graze it once or twice. And then the forage oat, the Italian ryegrass. We also had winter wheat in this. And the winter wheat, keep in mind, was spring planted. The forage barley was also a winter barley. The idea was that those would stay vegetative and continue to grow really well and not head. That was the case for the winter wheat. That was not the case for the forage barley. Here you can see the winter wheat only cut 3 times. This should have been cut or grazed before we came back on it, because it had gotten tall and stemmy or leafy and kind of lodged and laid down. And the forage barley on this cut here, we're looking at Kimberly. So this would have been August 14th is the date. So here we get on the, did you back that up? Go ahead and keep playing there, Jason. It's fine. You can see that the triticale is done on the 4-cut system. On this would have been August 21st at Kimberly, and it was just done. It gave its all before this point. So if you want season-long stuff, triticale is probably not your grass. Here's the Italian ryegrass, and keep in mind this is ryegrass. It's not cereal rye. And it really started coming on when the summer heat came on, and it was, I mean, this was our last cut, and we probably could have cut that 1, if not 2 more times, but that was kind of outside of the scope of our study at that point in time. Here, the winter wheat. As we started getting later into the season, there was some disease starting to show up in it a little bit. And we had a vole problem in this field later in the season also that caused us some issue. On the forage barley, it about gave its all by the time we got to the end of the season, but overall, it still did really well. In fact, and I'll give you the data, just some quick data right at the end of this, but overall, only the forage oat did better than forage barley. But kind of what you can see out of this is regardless, you can get more than 1 or 2 grazings out of these cereals, but you have to stay on top of them. If you do let them start to go reproductive, then they are going to want to start slowing down and not regrowing as well. Now this particular oat here, this was Everleaf, I believe, was the variety of this one. And it just season long really continued to put on vegetation and grow and do well. And of course, anybody who's grazed oats in the past will tell you that oats make pretty good grazing forage. So just quickly on this one here, I just want to show you some information. There's a lot more going on here than what I want to talk about. But as you look at this particular slide here, so what we're looking here is the species here that were cut 4 times. These are the cut dates up here. And on the total between 2 years and the 2 sites, looking across here, okay, and this is season long total. Keep that in mind. On the, come on. Okay, on the forage oat, it put on little over 4,700, almost 4,750 pounds. This is green. Forage barley was 4,767. So you can see those two were very similar. The Italian ryegrass, not too far behind at almost 4,500 pounds. The winter wheat, just a little over 3,900 pounds. And then we get over here to the triticale at 4,200 pounds. And that comes out of, these first 2 cuts, but really that second cut is where the triticale, as you can see, was putting on its weight. But after it started getting some maturity to it, it just really dropped off. So let's look at on the 3 cut system, again, 2 years, 2 sites, total yield on the 3 cut system. You can see that the forage oat really outpaced everything else at almost 5,800 pounds, again, green. The forage barley was a little over 4,100. Italian ryegrass was 44, just a little over 4,450 pounds, almost 4,000 pounds on the winter wheat. And then the triticale at a little over 4,300 pounds there. And you can kind of see on the 3 cut system that they grew a little longer. I think we were about 5.5 or 6 weeks between cuts. On the 4 cut system, we were about every 30 days. And so obviously they put on a lot more, but they got more mature and dropped off quicker. But they certainly still continue to produce on that. So just a little touch on something that's got a lot more data into it. And then here are several more folks who really helped us with this with the University of Idaho on this project. And I wanted to make sure and point them out as well. So with that, I think I'm going to quit and move quickly along to our final speakers on our tour today. So we're leaving Idaho and heading back down into Utah. Let me stop sharing here. There we go. All right, so on our final presentation today, I'd like to introduce Jacob Hadfield and Michael Pace. They currently work with Utah State University Extension in Cache and Box Elder counties, working with alfalfa, corn, small grain, and safflower crops. They received a multi-year grant to research cover crops in Utah due to the lack of information on growing them in the Intermountain region. And they're going to be sharing first-year results from the 2020 growing season. So welcome.
Thanks for that introduction and everything. It's good to be with you guys. I've really enjoyed the presentations that we've had today. Me and Mike are going to be presenting. I'm trying to get the right screen up here, so give me just 1 second. Here we go. Okay, there we go. Perfect. So Me and Mike Pace have been working on this project it's been a year now. They actually had some plots in the previous year. But this project is kind of looking at different cover crop mixes, different strategies to use cover crops in Utah. So I'm going to turn the time over to Mike to go ahead and introduce us into the project, and then I'll be going into a little bit more of the data involved with it. So.
Okay, so Jake, do you want to go to the next slide? So the reason why we started working at this is there's been, for the last 5 or 6 years, there's been a lot of soil health workshops and that around Utah. A lot of the presenters that they bring in are from the Midwest, and they give their information and that, but it's kind of irrelevant to here in Utah and in Intermountain West. And so that's where we kind of started looking at this project. Jake, next slide. And it's a collaboration between field staff and our specialists on campus. Next slide. And so we have 3 different locations in Utah, one kind of in central Utah, which is San Pete, and then Davis and Cache counties. And I'll tell you a little bit more about those areas here in just a second. And within those, we have some warm season and cool season. We have 5 different plots that we have in each of the warm season and cool season. And of course, we've got replicated plots so we can get the statistical analysis and that on them. We try to shoot for that 40-pound seeding rate, depending on what we're using. And then, as Jake kind of mentioned, most of our stuff, we're looking at conventional tillage and that, not a lot of no-till right now with these crops. So in Ephraim is kind of our high elevation area. We have a kind of an average growing season of about 120 days there. And on the left of that screen right there is kind of where those plots were established. And again, it was not probably a lot of activity in that soil right before we came in and established those plots. Next, Jake. Kaysville, this is kind of our lower elevation, high precip area, longest growing season of about 172 days. This area that we came into has been has never had anything grown in it for about the last 15, 20 years. And so when we came in here, we had to do a lot of weed control in that area before we came in and established those plots. And so when you look at the data in that, we applied no fertilizer to this plot right here, just breaking it out of that, sod right there. So Jake, next. And this is our last location. This is where most of our information that we're going to present today, because of the time limitation that we have, is in Cache County. Shortest growing season of the 3 at about 110 days, and about an 18-inch precip zone right there. And again, you can see this is a research farm. There's been lots of different projects there. Tillage is our conventional tillage operation that done on these. And this plot actually received some fertilizer, some nitrogen prior to us establishing our plots in here. And I think you'll see the difference in that when we start looking at the yield and the quality on these plots. So next slide, Jake. We tried to establish our plots using something that a farmer would. So here you can see a Great Plains drill. This is again our Lewiston planting that we did. This is on the 14th of May. So it was just a little bit before our last spring frost for that area. And you can see several of them had coats and that on. It was kind of a cool day for planting, but it was beautiful because we were able to get it in. And then we had, was it rain or snowstorm? I can't remember which. May have been both right before after we got done planting and that. So perfect timing for getting those in and getting some moisture on them to bring those cover crops up. On our mixes, so we're going to talk about our warm season mixes first. In talking with our specialists in that, one of the things we wanted to do was to, not to throw a bunch of different mixes in that out there, but we wanted to try and see what it would look like if you had something like sorghum sudan grass just as a monoculture out there, and then you add a legume to it in the hairy vetch. And so you can kind of see our control was the sudan grass, and then the mix number 1 had the sudan grass with about 25% of the mix being hairy vetch. And then you can see after the sudan grass and the hairy vetch, we added the buckwheat into it. The third mix, you can see we put the radish net in it, to where eventually the fourth mix is kind of what you would see, or what most of these people that are putting in a cover crop, or what the NRCS is recommending. You've got multiple grasses, multiple legumes and that in there to fill that mix.
So to kind of update you, so this picture was taken, so we planted, like Mike said, in May 14th. This picture was taken about June 26th. So it's about almost about 45 days there. And so you can see the kind of growth we got here in Lewiston. You can kind of see some of the differences. The pictures are kind of hard to focus in. You can see a lot of the Sudan grass in there. You can see a little bit of buckwheat and a few other things going on. But when we look at the 45-day, we took a forage analysis. And so you can kind of see the different protein levels throughout. So our control was about 17% protein. And as we added those mixes, mix number 1 had the legumes. So we do see a little bit more protein, 18.2%. And then in mix 4, where we had that huge mix just kind of a variety of different things, we see that there is larger amounts of protein available in the percentage there. And so just to kind of compare, if we look at what we saw in Kaysville, so again, remember in Lewiston, before we got these research plots to be able to use, it actually had already been fertilized in Lewiston. And so because of that, we do see that there were higher protein levels in Lewiston specifically. But in Kaysville, where we're going into kind of what had been weeds for about 15 to 20 years, we see that the protein levels are a little lower. There's some different values there overall. So just some good information to kind of keep in mind, especially through grazing and different practices on those warm season cover crops. Now, we carried this study all the way out into 80 days, and 80 days is when we took our yield. And as you can see from these pictures, Sudan grass, as well as some of the other cover crops, really, it kind of turned into a jungle. You can see it's taller than us. You can kind of see down in the corner on that drone picture where these plots were. And basically what we did with these plots to measure yield is you can kind of see in this picture here, you see that we had about a mower, a sickle bar mower that we went in about 20 feet with a 4-foot swath. And then we took all of the material from there and measured it in totes just so we could get an idea of yield per acre and tons per acre. And so with that data, this is just the machine we used in different things. But with that data, we decided to separate our yield into 2 dry matter percentages. First of all, we did one yield at 70% moisture. That's to resemble silage, kind of what your silage yield would look like, as well as we did a yield at 12% because that's more of a hay-based material. If farmers are choosing to go in and use this for, either one of those two. But as you can see with our yields, we see in Lewiston, one of the interesting things is as we go up, as we add those more ingredients into the cover crop mix, you see that we actually get higher yields at the end. That mix number 4, mix number 3 really did jump up in that yield. However, that wasn't true in all of our in all of our field studies. For instance, in Kaysville, we didn't see that. And in Ephraim, we didn't see that either. And so it's just kind of some things to point out that could have been due to the extra nutrition that was allowed to the cover crops in Lewiston. However, it might also just be where we were able to get the cover crops in. We actually tended when we were out there to see a little bit more of the variety in Lewiston compared to the other plots. The other plots had a lot more Sudan grass. So that's just something to consider there overall. But moving on, looking at the 80-day data for forage nutrition quality, I hope this gives you a good picture. I'm actually going to fly through this because I know we're short on time, but you can kind of see the different protein levels at each site. However, one of the big things we wanted to point out is the 45-day versus 80-day. And so we agree, and we didn't think about going cover crops, having them go all the way to 80 days. We didn't think that was a good idea. We just kind of did it to see yield and different things. But you can really see that the 45-day would probably be the most accurate point, or at least the most nutritious point, if you're using this for a grazing or forage endpoint. So, Mike, I'll turn it back to you for a second.
Okay, so then fall time, or I guess late August is when we started looking at our cool season mixes, something that you'll be establishing kind of after a wheat harvest or corn silage harvest. And what we started out with our control was our throughway mix. You can see wheat, barley, triticale in that is our base. And then we added a winter pea into that mix for number 1. Next slide, Jake. And then we added the radish, and then our turnips, and then finally we got to that overall mix of several grasses, several brassicas and legumes in there for our mix number 4, similar to what we did with our warm season. Next slide, Jake.
So with these cool season mixes, I apologize, they're putting salt out at the window. I don't know if you guys can hear that. But with the cool season mixes, we, like Mike said, we planted on August 17th to kind of mimic going in right after a grain crop. This picture was taken on August 31st. You can see we're getting a pretty good representation of the different cover crops there. However, at September 30th, which would have been about 45 days, you can just see that this is the kind of crop we had. And this was awesome. This was a great turnout. We didn't actually measure yield at this point because we're measuring it in the spring of next year when we allow it to come up. But really, honestly, we didn't have frost for quite a while here in the valley. And so this crop actually grew for a long time before it finally died out.
I think to mention on that is the fact that, you would have had some happy cows coming home off the range and turn them into a pasture like that.
Yeah, perfect.
So one of the other things we decided to do is with a lot of these mixes, growers, can't really visualize what that millet is going to look like, what the Sudan grass, hairy vetch, some of those would look like. And so what we did is we took 18 different species that are typically recommended in some of these cover crops, and we planted them out in a single drill width. And so you can kind of see there at the top picture, that's one of the millets. I think that's the white millet right there with the one of the grass, the sorghum Sudan grass right behind it there. And then you can kind of see, we pulled up some of the radishes, some of the turnips in that, just to give them a visualization of what those plants look like. Next, Jake.
And to go along with that, we also put in some mixes. We did a warm season 10-way mix, cool season 8-way mix, cool season 6-way mix. We did a bunch of different mixes so that farmers could actually see it. And you can see it in this drone picture, how as we go down, as we did a couple drill widths on each of these, you can see the differences as you kind of go through the different mixes and different things. We took some data on them. These weren't replicated plots, so this data isn't really necessarily on the research-based side, but we did want to just get some numbers to see what kind of things we were seeing here. You can see the 45-day compared to 80-day values, and you can see that there were warm season mixes here as well as cool season. We also see in the yields the 70% moisture and the 12% moisture again. So you can kind of see these numbers here just as a demonstration purpose overall. To see kind of what we had. Is there anything else you'd like to say on that, Mike?
Sorry about that. No, I think you did a good job covering that, Jake.
Okay, perfect. And just to wrap up, we know we had to hurry through this. We just want to thank, we had a lot of people working on this project. We want to thank everyone who was involved. And due to time, we probably won't be able to do questions. I do see some in the chat, but I'll turn the time back over to Steve and Jason here. So
yeah, I think if you guys wanted to take a couple of questions there, you could. That'd be all right.
Okay, no, that's great.
I think to point out right there, that cover crop mix that we had. Oh, Jake, you pulled it down on me. The diversity that we saw right there, that was really cool from a researcher standpoint to go out into that field right there and look. You can see the sunflower, you can see the oats, you can see the Phacelia, you can see some buckwheat there. Just a really nice blend of different mixes right there. So a really cool photo.
Yeah, and you can see over here, this is more of a warm season. This also shows the variety. I mean, we got mustard, buckwheat. You can see kind of some of the turnip and radish down low. And that's one thing we did see is that when these are put together, a lot of times we do see a pretty good synergistic effect between the different mixes being combined. So.
Yeah, any questions?
Yeah, I'm not seeing any in the question and answer box now. Let's see, there is one question. Can we get download of the slides that'll be shared in these presentations? These are being recorded, and we will get these put up where, Jason?
They will be placed on the University of Idaho Extension College of Ag and Life Sciences YouTube channel. But I will send out a reminder. If you officially registered, you will get an email that says, hey, here's the video recording of the one you missed, potentially. So if you're not registered, then send an email to the one that I'm going to put in the chat.
Yeah, and I would offer, at least for myself, that if there was something specific that you saw on the slides that you would like some more information on, or specific information, don't hesitate to contact one of the presenters and ask, or you can send me an email and I will get those requests passed along as well. And or you can send them to Jason and he'll pass from me. He just put his email in the chat box. So
The question there on what did the wheat yield at Snowville, that was, are you asking following the cover crops, and if that was it, it was quite low. I think it was less than 10 bushel per acre out there when they did the cover crop before that. It was really pretty bad in comparison to the typical conventional tillage practices.
yeah, it kind of looked like they were threshing in road gear in Earl's video. Okay. Well, I don't see any other questions. Jason, do you see any other questions? All right, he's busy putting stuff in the chat box there. So with that, I think we'll wrap up our tour for today. Really appreciate all the presenters taking time. I know it's a lot of work to get these videos put together and, you know, do all this stuff, and really appreciate all the work. It was very interesting, and I learned a lot. I would again encourage you to please fill out the survey once we're finished here today. We really do need that information. It helps us with things that we have to do as well. Would like to encourage you to make sure and register for workshop number 3, which will be after the holidays on January 7th. And then we're going to wrap up on January 14th with a really more of a breakout groups where we have the opportunity to visit about some identified needs for future work. We'll talk about that a little bit more on January 7th. So with that, I'd like to wish you all a happy holidays. Hope you have a peaceful and restful time, and we will see you after the new year.